Ladies and gentlemen, today, we gather to remember one of history's darkest chapters, the horrors of Auschwitz, Adolf Hitler's deadliest concentration camp. It was not just a camp, it was a factory of death, a place where millions perished under the brutal Nazi regime. Auschwitz was not just one camp, but a vast network of facilities, including WWII, the main camp, Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the extermination camp, and Auschwitz III Monowitz, a labor camp for industrial work. It was strategically located in Nazi-occupied Poland, chosen for its central position in Europe and access to railroads, which made transporting victims easier. Initially, Auschwitz was built to imprison Polish political prisoners, intellectuals, and resistance fighters, but by 1942, it became the center of the Holocaust, the mass genocide of Jews in Europe. The Nazis transformed it into a site of industrial-scale murder, with gas chambers, crematoria, forced labor zones, and brutal living conditions designed to systematically dehumanize and exterminate people. The camp's expansion was rapid, with Auschwitz II-Birkenau becoming the largest killing center of the Holocaust. Jews, Romani people, Soviet POWs, and other persecuted groups were deported from across Nazi-occupied territories, arriving in packed cattle cars under horrific conditions. Many died during transport due to lack of food, water, and sanitation. Upon arrival, prisoners were subjected to a selection process. The strong were forced into labor, while the weak, including children and the elderly, were sent directly to the gas chambers. By the time Auschwitz was liberated in January 1945, more than 1.1 million people had been murdered, making it the deadliest concentration camp of Hitler's regime. It remains a lasting symbol of the horrors of Nazi brutality and the consequences of unchecked hatred and totalitarian rule. Auschwitz became the largest killing center of the Holocaust, where more than 1.1 million people lost their lives between 1940 and 1945. The vast majority of those murdered, about 90%, were Jewish men, women, and children who had been deported from Nazi-occupied countries across Europe. They arrived in tightly packed cattle cars, often after enduring days without food, water, or basic sanitation. Many of them did not even make it off the trains alive due to the inhumane conditions of transport. Upon arrival, Nazi SS officers conducted brutal selections. Those deemed unfit for work, including pregnant women, young children, the elderly, and the sick, were immediately sent to the gas chambers. Others were assigned to forced labor under horrific conditions. The mass executions were carried out using Zyklon B, a deadly pesticide originally intended for fumigation but repurposed for genocide. Victims were deceived into believing they were entering showers for disinfection, only to be suffocated by poison gas within minutes. But Jews were not the only victims. Romani people, Gypsies, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish intellectuals, political prisoners, and other persecuted groups were also systematically exterminated. Many were executed by firing squads, died from forced starvation, or were subjected to inhumane medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors like Joseph Mengele. The death toll at Auschwitz is staggering. Approximately 960,000 Jews were killed, the majority in gas chambers. 74,000 non-Jewish Poles perished due to executions, forced labor, and starvation. 21,000 Romani people were murdered, victims of Nazi racial policies. 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war were executed or worked to death. 10,000 other victims, including political dissidents and resistance fighters, also perished. Auschwitz was not just a death camp, but a machine of mass murder, designed to exterminate entire populations efficiently. Those who were not killed immediately faced starvation, forced labor, disease, and brutal treatment, leading to a slow, painful death. The scale of killing at Auschwitz remains one of the most horrifying aspects of World War II and the Holocaust. Auschwitz became the most infamous representation of the final solution, Adolf Hitler's systematic plan to annihilate the Jewish population of Europe. The term final solution was a euphemism used by the Nazis to describe their goal of exterminating the Jewish people. This policy was formalized at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where high-ranking Nazi officials planned the logistics of mass murder. Auschwitz played a crucial role in turning this ideology into reality, becoming a primary site for industrialized genocide. The camp was uniquely designed to maximize the efficiency of mass killings. Unlike traditional prisons or labor camps, Auschwitz functioned as a murder factory, where the process of extermination was carried out with ruthless precision. Deportation trains arrived daily from Nazi-occupied territories, carrying thousands of victims from countries including Poland, Hungary, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Greece. Upon arrival, Nazi SS officers, including the infamous Dr. Joseph Mengele, conducted selections on the train platforms. Those considered unfit for work, including women, children, the elderly, and the sick, were immediately sent to the gas chambers. Within minutes of stepping off the train, many victims were stripped of their clothes, belongings, and dignity before being herded into what they were told were showers. Instead, they were locked inside chambers where Zyklon B gas was released, suffocating them in agonizing death. The Nazis meticulously planned every aspect of the killings, even developing methods to dispose of the bodies efficiently. Large crematoria were built to incinerate thousands of corpses daily, and the ashes were dumped in nearby rivers, fields, or used as fertilizer. Victims' hair was shaved and used for textiles, their gold teeth were extracted and melted down, and their belongings were sorted in warehouses. Auschwitz became the ultimate representation of Nazi cruelty, a place where human life was reduced to mere numbers in a deadly machine of mass murder. The camp stood as the centerpiece of the final solution, making Hitler's vision of a Jew-free Europe a horrifying reality. One of the most harrowing aspects of Auschwitz was the way victims were transported to the camp under the most brutal and inhumane conditions. The Nazis deported millions of people from occupied countries across Europe, including Poland, Hungary, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, and Italy. Most of these victims were Jews, but Romani people, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and others were also sent to Auschwitz. Deportation was carried out primarily by train, with victims crammed into overcrowded cattle cars designed for transporting livestock, not people. These wooden boxcars had no windows, no ventilation, and no seating. Up to 100 men, women, and children were packed into a single car, with barely any room to sit. There were no toilets, no food, and no water, and the journey could last for days, depending on the departure location. Many people, especially the elderly and young children, died from suffocation, dehydration, or exhaustion before even reaching Auschwitz. When the trains finally arrived at the camp, Nazi SS officers, often accompanied by barking guard dogs, forced prisoners out of the boxcars. The scene was one of terror and confusion. People were disoriented after days of suffering in the cramped trains, and many were too weak to walk. Mothers clutched their children, families tried to stay together, and elderly victims struggled to keep up. But within moments, they were brutally separated, often forever. The SS carried out a ruthless selection process on the train platform, deciding who would live and who would die. Doctors, including the notorious Joseph Mengele, quickly examined prisoners, often with a mere glance. Those deemed unfit for forced labor, including pregnant women, children, the sick, the disabled, and the elderly, were sent directly to the gas chambers. Those selected for temporary survival were stripped of everything. All personal belongings, money, jewelry, clothing, and even wedding rings were confiscated. Their heads were shaved, their names were replaced with tattooed identification numbers, and they were given ragged prisoner uniforms. Many were left unrecognizable, even to their own families. The brutal arrival process at Auschwitz was designed to dehumanize victims from the very beginning, stripping them of their identity, dignity, and hope. For most, stepping off the train meant stepping into a nightmare from which they would never escape. Auschwitz was designed to be the largest and most efficient killing center in Nazi-occupied Europe, where mass murder was carried out with horrifying precision. The primary method of extermination was the gas chambers, which could kill thousands of people at a time within minutes. However, many prisoners who were not immediately sent to the gas chambers suffered slow and agonizing deaths due to starvation, disease, and relentless forced labor. The gas chambers and Zyklon B. The Nazis initially experimented with different killing methods, including mass shootings and carbon monoxide poisoning, but they found these methods too slow and inefficient. By 1942, they had perfected a more effective method, Zyklon B gas. Originally used as an insecticide, Zyklon B was a cyanide-based chemical that suffocated victims within 10 to 20 minutes after exposure. Prisoners selected for immediate death were told they were being taken for disinfection and a warm shower. They were ordered to strip naked and were led into large underground chambers disguised as communal bathing areas. Once the doors were sealed, SS officers dropped pellets of Zyklon B through special openings in the ceiling. The heat and humidity of the crowded chamber activated the gas, causing suffocation and violent convulsions as victims struggled to breathe. Up to 2,000 people could be murdered in a single gassing session. Once the victims were dead, special prisoner units called the Sonderkommando were forced to remove the bodies, extract gold teeth, shave the hair, which was later used for textile production, and transport the corpses to the Crematoria, where they were burned to ash. Starvation and disease. For those not sent directly to the gas chambers, Auschwitz was a place of unimaginable suffering. Food rations were deliberately kept so low that most prisoners were in a constant state of starvation. A typical daily meal consisted of a small piece of stale bread, sometimes mixed with sawdust, a bowl of watery soup, often made from rotting vegetables, occasionally a small portion of margarine or artificial coffee. This meager diet provided far fewer calories than the human body needs to survive, especially for prisoners forced into grueling labor. As a result, most inmates quickly became emaciated, weak, and vulnerable to disease. Outbreaks of typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and other deadly infections spread rapidly due to overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and the presence of lice. Medical treatment was almost non-existent, and those who became too weak to work were sent to the gas chambers or executed. Forced labor and exhaustion. Those considered fit to work were subjected to brutal forced labor, often in freezing temperatures with inadequate clothing. Prisoners were made to construct new buildings and expand the camp, carry out backbreaking work in quarries and coal mines, work in German factories that produced weapons and goods for the Nazi war effort. Many prisoners collapsed from exhaustion, malnutrition, or untreated injuries, only to be beaten or shot by guards. Others deliberately threw themselves onto the high-voltage electric fences surrounding the camp, choosing a quick death over slow suffering. The Nazis' goal was not just to kill prisoners, but to exploit their labor until they were too weak to continue, at which point they would be executed or sent to the gas chambers. Auschwitz was a place of both immediate and prolonged death, where suffering was inflicted at every possible level. Among the many horrors of Auschwitz, one of the most infamous was the inhumane medical experimentation carried out by Nazi doctors, particularly Dr. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death. Mengele, an SS officer and physician, was obsessed with genetics, racial purity, and eugenics, and he used Auschwitz prisoners, without consent or anesthesia, as test subjects for his twisted experiments. Mengele's selection process. Mengele was one of the SS officers who oversaw the selection process on the train platforms. While most SS doctors simply pointed prisoners toward either forced labor or the gas chambers, Mengele took special interest in certain groups. Twins. People with physical abnormalities, dwarfs, giants, or hunchbacks. Pregnant women. Prisoners with unique eye colors or other rare genetic traits. He often smiled and appeared kind to children, offering them sweets before leading them to his laboratory. Many victims had no idea they were about to endure agonizing procedures that would end in death. Experiments on twins. Mengele had an obsession with twins, believing they held the key to understanding genetics and advancing Nazi racial theories. He selected hundreds of twin children, mostly Jewish and Romani, and subjected them to cruel experiments, including blood transfusions between twins to see if one twin could survive with the other's blood, injecting dyes or chemicals into children's eyes in an attempt to artificially change their color, deliberately infecting one twin with a disease to observe how long they could survive compared to their sibling, surgical procedures without anesthesia, including amputations and organ removal. If one twin died, the other was often murdered so that Mengele could perform comparative autopsies. Survivors later recalled that twins were treated better at first, given extra food, but only to keep them alive long enough for experiments. Brutal sterilization and mutilation. Mengele also experimented on forced sterilization techniques designed to prevent the reproduction of groups the Nazis deemed undesirable. Women were subjected to high-dose X-rays that severely burned their reproductive organs. Injection of caustic chemicals into the uterus, causing unbearable pain, infection, and death. Surgical removal of reproductive organs without anesthesia. Men were also subjected to painful genital mutilations, castrations, and sterilization procedures. Many victims died from infections, excessive bleeding, or sheer agony. Surgeries and disease experiments. Other horrifying experiments at Auschwitz included amputations and limb transplants to test how bodies reacted to shock and infection. Injecting prisoners with deadly diseases such as typhus, tuberculosis, and malaria to observe their effects. Forcing prisoners to drink seawater to study dehydration and survival. Testing the effects of hypothermia, where victims were submerged in ice-cold water to measure how long it took for them to die. The fate of Mengele and his victims. Unlike most Nazis involved in Auschwitz's atrocities, Mengele was never captured or tried for his crimes. After the war, he escaped to South America, living under a false identity in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil until his death in 1979. He never expressed remorse for the suffering he caused. Most of his victims did not survive. Those who did often suffered lifelong physical and psychological trauma, with their bodies permanently disfigured. The testimonies of survivors have provided a haunting record of Mengele's nightmarish medical abuse, making him one of history's most infamous war criminals. At Auschwitz, forced labor was both a tool of Nazi oppression and a method of systematic extermination. The Nazis exploited prisoners for economic gain, forcing them to work under brutal conditions that led to exhaustion, malnutrition, and ultimately death. Those who were deemed fit upon arrival were not spared from suffering. They were condemned to labor until their bodies could no longer endure the abuse. Types of forced labor. Auschwitz had multiple work assignments, many of which were deliberately designed to break prisoners both physically and mentally. Camp construction and expansion. Prisoners were made to build the very structures that would imprison and kill them. Barracks, gas chambers, crematoria, and fences were all constructed by inmate labor. They were given primitive tools or forced to use their bare hands to dig foundations and carry heavy materials. Many collapsed from exhaustion, only to be beaten or shot by SS guards. Industrial work for German companies. The Nazis partnered with German companies to use Auschwitz prisoners as free labor. IG Farben, Krupp, and Siemens were among the corporations that set up factories near the camp, producing rubber, chemicals, and weapons for the German war effort. Prisoners in these factories worked 14 to 16 hours a day in harsh conditions, receiving almost no food or rest. Mines and quarries. Some of the most grueling labor involved stone quarries and coal mines. Prisoners were forced to extract raw materials, often in extreme weather, using only primitive tools. The physically demanding work, combined with malnutrition, led to a high mortality rate. The Canada warehouses. One of the most infamous labor assignments was working in Canada, the warehouse complex where the belongings of murdered prisoners were sorted. The name stemmed from the idea that Canada was a land of wealth, because these warehouses contained vast amounts of stolen valuables, including gold, jewelry, clothing, and food. Prisoners assigned to Canada had slightly better conditions, as they could sometimes steal extra food or warm clothing. However, they were constantly aware that the belongings they handled came from victims who had just been murdered. Personal servants for SS officers. Some prisoners, especially women, were forced to clean SS officers' quarters, cook, and wash clothes. While these jobs were physically less demanding, they often came with sexual exploitation and abuse. The extreme conditions of forced labor. Prisoners worked without proper clothing, in freezing winters and scorching summers. They were given wooden shoes that caused blisters and infections, or sometimes forced to work barefoot. The lack of nutrition, combined with the physical demands of labor, caused many to collapse from exhaustion. The daily rations were completely inadequate for heavy labor. A single bowl of watery soup. A small piece of bread, sometimes mixed with sawdust. Occasionally, a small portion of margarine or sugar. This starvation diet meant that prisoners quickly lost weight, became weak, and developed severe illnesses. Those who could no longer work were executed, sent to the gas chambers, or left to die from disease.
Punishment and death.
Guards routinely beat, tortured, or killed prisoners who worked too slowly or made mistakes. Some prisoners were forced to carry out pointless, backbreaking tasks, such as moving heavy rocks from one place to another for no reason. Many prisoners, unable to endure the suffering any longer, threw themselves against the high-voltage electric fences, choosing death over slow torment. Others collapsed from exhaustion, only to be dragged away and executed. Slave labor and the Nazi war machine. The Nazis saw Auschwitz not just as a place of extermination but also as a labor camp designed to fuel their war machine. The forced labor of prisoners helped keep Nazi industries running, providing materials for weapons, infrastructure, and supplies. However, for most prisoners, forced labor was simply another method of extermination. The Nazis had no intention of allowing them to survive. They were worked to death, starved, and broken until their bodies gave out. Auschwitz was a place where labor was not just a punishment but a slow, calculated form of execution. Life inside Auschwitz was defined by extreme overcrowding, starvation, filth, and brutal mistreatment. The Nazis designed the camp to strip prisoners of their dignity and humanity, ensuring that even those who were not immediately killed in the gas chambers suffered a slow, agonizing existence. The conditions in the barracks were so horrific that many prisoners succumbed to disease, exhaustion, and despair long before facing execution. Overcrowded and inhumane living quarters. Auschwitz was never intended to house so many people, but as the Nazis expanded their campaign of genocide, the number of prisoners surged far beyond capacity. Barracks that were originally meant for a few hundred people were packed with over 1,000. Prisoners were forced to sleep in triple-stacked wooden bunks, with several people crammed together on a single plank. There were no mattresses, only thin straw or filthy rags, often infested with lice and fleas. During the winter, prisoners shivered in freezing temperatures, their breath visible in the damp air as frost formed inside the barracks. Many had only thin, tattered uniforms and wooden clogs, completely inadequate for the brutal Polish winters. In summer, the heat was unbearable, with the stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and death filling the air. Starvation and malnutrition. The daily food rations at Auschwitz were designed to keep prisoners alive just long enough to extract labor from them, but never to sustain them. A prisoner's diet consisted of a single bowl of watery soup, often made from rotting vegetables or animal scraps. A small piece of bread, sometimes mixed with sawdust to make it stretch further. Occasionally, a tiny portion of margarine, sugar, or ersatz coffee. This diet provided far fewer calories than needed for survival, especially for prisoners forced to perform grueling labor. Within weeks, prisoners became skeletal, their bodies eating away at muscle and fat to stay alive. Their stomachs swelled from malnutrition, and many suffered from extreme weakness, dizziness, and organ failure. Prisoners were constantly hungry, their thoughts consumed by food. Many resorted to eating grass, insects, or scraps from garbage heaps. Some risked their lives to steal food, but if caught, they were brutally beaten or executed on the spot. Lack of sanitation and deadly disease. Sanitation in Auschwitz was non-existent. The barracks had no proper toilets, no running water, and no ability to wash. Prisoners were given only a few minutes each morning to use communal latrines, which were nothing more than holes in the ground or open troughs. These latrines overflowed with human waste, attracting swarms of rats and insects. Because prisoners were rarely allowed to bathe, their bodies were covered in dirt, sweat, and sores. Lice and fleas infested every barrack, spreading typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and other deadly diseases. Medical treatment was non-existent, and those who became too sick to work were either left to die or taken to the gas chambers. Brutality from guards and capos. Beyond starvation and disease, prisoners faced constant violence from Nazi SS guards and capos, prisoners appointed as supervisors. Guards would beat prisoners with rifle butts, whips, or clubs for the smallest infractions. Force prisoners to stand outside for hours in freezing temperatures as punishment. Stage random executions, hanging or shooting prisoners to instill fear. The capos, who were often criminals or political prisoners, were given small privileges in exchange for enforcing Nazi brutality. Many of them abused fellow inmates, stealing food, beating weaker prisoners, and carrying out orders with sadistic enthusiasm. Nightmares in the barracks. At night, the barracks were filled with moans of the sick, cries of the dying, and the sounds of prisoners talking in hushed voices about lost loved ones. There were no blankets, no pillows, and no relief from the crushing exhaustion. The overwhelming sense of despair was inescapable. Prisoners who went to sleep never knew if they would wake up the next morning. Despite everything, some prisoners clung to tiny acts of defiance and humanity. They whispered prayers, sang quiet songs, or held on to memories of family members. Others shared crumbs of bread or offered comforting words to those on the verge of giving up. But for most, Auschwitz was a place where the body and spirit were systematically broken, leaving behind only suffering and hopelessness. Auschwitz was not only a site of mass extermination, but also a place where daily, systematic executions were carried out in full view of prisoners. These executions were designed to spread terror, eliminate perceived threats, and reinforce Nazi dominance. No prisoner was safe. Anyone could be killed at any time, for any reason, or for no reason at all. Public hangings as psychological warfare. One of the most horrific and demoralizing forms of execution at Auschwitz was public hanging. The Nazis staged these executions in open spaces, forcing thousands of prisoners to watch as their fellow inmates were killed. Prisoners could be hanged for various reasons, including attempting to escape, stealing food, helping fellow prisoners, sabotaging Nazi operations, or showing any form of resistance. The process was slow and designed to be as humiliating as possible. Prisoners were often made to stand on wooden stools with a noose around their necks, while an SS officer gave a speech about the consequences of defying Nazi rule. Then, the stool was kicked away, and the victim struggled, choking to death while thousands of prisoners were forced to watch in silence. In some cases, the Nazis forced prisoners, including children, to act as executioners, making them pull the stool away from a friend or family member. This psychological torture further broke the spirit of inmates, forcing them into complicity in the camp's brutality. Mass shootings in the death wall area. Another common method of execution was mass shootings, which took place in a secluded courtyard between blocks 10 and 11, known as the death wall. Prisoners were brought here for infractions like minor rule breaking, failing to meet work quotas, being too weak or sick to continue labor. SS guards lined up prisoners against the wall and shot them in the back of the head, execution style. Some were made to kneel, others forced to stand. The wall itself became stained with blood, a constant reminder of the endless killings. At times, entire groups of prisoners, sometimes dozens or even hundreds at a time, were executed in mass shootings. The bodies were then thrown into pits or taken to the crematoria to be burned. Brutal beatings and torture leading to death. For many prisoners, death was not quick or merciful. The SS used brutal beatings and torture to punish prisoners or simply entertain themselves. Some methods included beatings with rifle butts, whips, or metal rods until prisoners collapsed, coughing up blood, tying prisoners' hands behind their backs and suspending them from poles or hooks, a form of torture known as the post. This often dislocated shoulders or caused death by suffocation. Kicking and stomping prisoners to death in random acts of violence. Prisoners accused of minor infractions were often subjected to long torture sessions, where guards experimented with how much pain a body could endure before death. Executions as a warning to others. Every execution at Auschwitz had a psychological purpose. The Nazis wanted to terrorize prisoners into absolute obedience by making examples of those who resisted. If a prisoner attempted to escape, The Nazis often retaliated by executing dozens or even hundreds of others in response. This collective punishment discouraged further escape attempts, as prisoners knew that even if they tried to run, their friends and families would suffer. Many prisoners reached a point where they no longer feared death. It was seen as a release from suffering. However, the Nazis wanted to make sure that fear remained, so they made executions as painful, humiliating, and public as possible. Auschwitz was not just a place where people were murdered. It was a place where death itself was turned into a spectacle of terror, ensuring that every survivor lived in constant fear. Auschwitz became the largest killing center of the Holocaust, where the Nazis implemented their most efficient method of mass murder: the gas chambers. This process was designed to eliminate prisoners on an unprecedented scale, allowing the Nazis to kill thousands of people per day without using bullets or soldiers in direct combat. The gas chambers and crematoria symbolized the cold, industrialized nature of genocide, where human lives were reduced to mere numbers in a system of mass extermination. The deception of the showers. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, prisoners were divided into two groups: those deemed fit to work, and those who would be sent to immediate death. Elderly people, children, pregnant women, the sick, and many others were often marked for execution within hours of stepping off the train. The Nazis carefully disguised the gas chambers as communal shower facilities to prevent panic and resistance. Victims were told they would receive a shower and disinfection before being assigned to work. They needed to remove their clothes and leave their belongings in an orderly manner. Their possessions would be returned after the shower, furthering the illusion that they were simply undergoing routine hygiene measures. The chambers had fake shower heads installed in the ceilings to maintain the deception. Guards ensured a smooth, orderly process, sometimes even speaking kindly to victims to keep them calm. Mothers walked hand in hand with their children, completely unaware that they were stepping into their death. The process of gassing. Once the chamber was sealed, SS officers dropped Zyklon B pellets through openings in the ceiling or walls. Zyklon B was a pesticide originally used to kill lice, but in large, concentrated amounts, it released lethal cyanide gas. As the gas spread, victims began to cough, choke, and panic within minutes. Their lungs burned, and their bodies convulsed as they struggled to breathe. Many trampled each other in desperation, trying to claw at the doors or reach higher ground to escape the fumes. Within 10 to 20 minutes, every person inside was dead. After the massacre, prisoners known as Sonderkommando, Jews forced to assist in the extermination process, were brought in to remove the bodies. These men worked under constant threat of execution, knowing that they too would eventually be killed to eliminate witnesses. Disposal of the bodies, the crematoria. The Nazis needed a way to dispose of thousands of corpses efficiently while hiding the evidence of their crimes. The solution was mass cremation. The bodies were taken to large crematoria where massive ovens burned the remains. The ashes were then dumped into nearby rivers or ponds, buried in mass graves, scattered in surrounding fields. At times, when the crematoria could not keep up with the number of dead, the Nazis resorted to open-air burning. Huge pits were dug, filled with bodies, and set on fire using gasoline or other accelerants. The smoke and smell of burning human flesh choked the air for miles. The scale of death. The gas chambers at Auschwitz could kill up to 6,000 people per day. Over the course of the camp's operation, more than 1 million people, mostly Jews, but also Poles, Romani, Soviet prisoners of war, and others, were exterminated in this way. The efficiency of Auschwitz's extermination process made it the most infamous death camp of the Holocaust. Here, the Nazis turned murder into an assembly line operation, where human lives were systematically erased in the most horrifying way imaginable.